Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference. And what a pleasure it is for me to have a bunch of my old friends who I've known for so many years in my career to join us for our session today. Say their names, how Black lives came to matter in America. These are the authors of the book. Welcome, 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 my friends.
Good to be
Thank
here.
you for having us, Neil.
Yeah,
Good to
absolutely.
see your face.
You know it. Good to see you all. We've got Michael Cottman, Patrice Gaines, Curtis Bunn, Nick Charles, and Keith Hairston can't be with us today, but I know he's here in spirit, and we'll get into some of the things he wrote about as well. And Mike, I know I've kind of talked to each of you all in various points over the past year and a half. I think Nick, you and I were working on a project when you were right on deadline trying to get these things done. And Mike, where did this idea come from and why? Certainly everyone was talking about George Floyd last year, but how did this book kind of stand to the top of the list of why you all wanted to come together kind of to write about this subject?
Yeah, Neil, thanks for having us on this program. We really appreciate it. And thanks for the question. And you're right. After the murder of George Floyd, and America started to take a hard look at race and systemic racism and racial discrimination in this country, I thought that there was a need for a broader conversation, a deep dive and a deep look at some of these systemic racial issues, issues that have been in some ways holding us back. The Trump administration's rollback on a lot of civil rights policies, that we've enjoyed for a number of years. And I thought that this was a broader reach, something that needed a deep look. And so I knew I couldn't do it alone, right? I mean, this is a big project, something very thoughtful, and covered a lot of ground, Neil. I mean, so we're dealing with Black Lives Matter, right? Black women in leadership, racial discrimination in healthcare, policing in America, mass incarceration, COVID-19, and the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on this African-American community. No way in the world I could do this alone. So I thought I would reach out to 4 people who I know well, who are seasoned journalists, who know these issues personally, who could dive in and get this done. So I reached out to Curtis, I reached out to Nick and Patrice and Keith, and just asked them, throughout these subjects, but not saying that you have to write about these particular subjects, but what are you interested in? One huge element of this book Nick Charles wrote about, and that is the role of the Black church. And that's something that hasn't been discussed a lot. And I talked to Nick a little bit about that, and it's everybody, these sections are extraordinary. They're deep, they're thoughtful. I'm so proud of all these writers. It's unparalleled, and this is unprecedented because when you talk to our publisher, the Hachette Book Group, our publishers will tell us that there are few books that have been written by 5 writers in one voice to cover all of these heavy duty, important, critical issues. And so I look at this book and not just a book for the Black community, but a book for the broader audience to learn and take away from what we're trying to achieve here. So that's sort of the backdrop of it. I mean, we can talk a little more about it, but it was somewhat born out of George Floyd, but I will say also born out of all the experiences these writers bring to this book.
And I tell you what, Michael, when you presented the idea to me, there was no hesitation in saying I wanted a part of it, even though we hadn't fleshed it out completely. I think we all understood what we were dealing with. We were living in a moment in time that is historic in nature and will be talked about for years to come. And we are one opportunity, it was our opportunity to chronicle it in a way that was thoughtful and compassionate and give the kind of insight that when people look back on it, they can feel like they were there. I think about many of your students now, where you are, Neil, in North Texas, they weren't born during 9/11, or some of them who are older maybe were babies. So they have to go on movies and what people live through. and books. And that's what this next generation is going to have to rely on. Say their names, How Black Lives Came to Matter will be one of those books that really chronicles what took place in a thoughtful way, and in a way that's much deeper than just what happened, but how we got there, past experiences that led to where we were, and kind of, I guess, should say where we are, and maybe a pathway to getting out of some of this madness.
Well, I wanted to kind of ditto that and say too that I think all of us have individually written about these topics, and this was such a great opportunity to be able to thread it all together. You know, you write a story here, you write one there, you write one, but to be able to follow it so that you can connect the dots for people, and show in a comprehensive way. And I mean, I learned from reading what each one of my co-authors wrote too. So I know I felt so proud of the product when we finished. I feel like it will really add a lot to history, you know, when people need to, that generation we talk about, or even others who don't understand or who have also read a story here and a story there. In this book, you get to connect all the dots.
I think one of the most important things is that we as a group and as individuals have been preparing for this moment all our lives. To echo what Patrice says, we've been writing about this stuff throughout our careers, one-offs, series, packages, but we haven't, in the way we've done it in this book, Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America, we've really gone deeper and given people a real sense of context. You know, George Floyd getting murdered, we all know wasn't the first Black person to get shot by police. But the intersection and the moment of being locked up at home because of a pandemic. Ahmaud Arbery had happened in February. Breonna Taylor had happened in April. And we were like, wait a minute, there's a pandemic and Black people, nobody's in the street and we're still getting shot. Right. So people were a little bit perturbed, to say the least. And I think what people had to understand is at that moment, we had an audience, a captive audience, and we had a global audience, because you saw marches in other countries where, you know, there aren't many Black folks, African American or otherwise, but people were expressing anger, outrage, surprise at this fact that these things were still going on. We, as the five of us, knew these things were always going on. They were exposed by COVID. They have been going on for a long time. And this was an opportunity to say to everyone, hey, now we have a chance of the spotlight, we get the stage, let's really let folks know what has happened and what is still continuing going to happen and going on. So when Mike asked me to do something, I said, of course, because, you know, as I said, we've been preparing this all my life. I could have closed my eyes and written half of this without having to done all the reporting I did, but that was more important, to get the voices of the people we got in this book. And that's the most important thing, is we knew who to go to. We had the people that in our Rolodexes, on our phones, to go to and say, hey, tell me that story you told me last year or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because it's still relevant. And that's the important thing of this book. This book is going to be relevant for generations. It's the snapshot of history and time, but it's still going to be relevant.
I love this idea of how you kind of capture the voices of these issues that, you know, everyone is talking about, you all have covered. And now you've kind of put it in a single volume to kind of capture that. I'm curious, I'll start with you, Mike, and we can go around the table. How do you make sure it doesn't, how do you avoid the cliche, right? Because, I think at some point, all of our careers, we've joked about the story and the quote that some of our editors have always wanted. Well, the structure of the story has to be this way. You all have shown throughout your careers how you have never approached that cliche story. So how do you, for folks who are going to read this, how do they know they're going to get something fresh and not the same old story? What was your thinking and how you bring these stories alive?
Well, first of all, I will say that this is the first time that Black writers have come together for a book to write about a pandemic while in a pandemic. So first of all, that's going to be fresh, because we have never, this is unprecedented. Nobody's ever covered a pandemic before, written a book about a pandemic, being in a pandemic. So we are dealing with this. Not all of us are touched by this. We all know people who have been sick from COVID, have been impacted by COVID in some way. have had their family members involved in some way of this pandemic. So there's a fresh approach. I want to say one thing, and I'll get back to that, and that's about sourcing. And it went to the heart of what Patrice just talked about, and Nick, and when he said, we've been preparing for this all our lives. Curtis, Nick, Patrice, and Keith have deep Rolodexes. And Rolodexes, I'm showing my age, right? So now, I guess, in Word docs, right? The Rolodex, your students don't even know what a Rolodex is. They know so many people, and so many important people, and so many people to share insights, that it was incredible for me to watch the process as well. Because, and keep this in mind, we did about 2 years of work in 6 months. Right, when we got this book deal, and this is what I think people need to know, we had a hard deadline, which was about 6 months. We had to complete this. They didn't bat an eye. I'm on it. I'll get it done. I'll do it. They did, and that comes from experience, and that comes with a wealth of knowledge and insight that they have themselves, but it also comes with building relationships, and that's what reporting is all about: building relationships. So when you go back to the question about fresh. What's fresh is that these people get fresh comments from people about, these serious issues, such as, again, the pandemic, incarceration, deep roots that Patrice has, the Black church, again, Nick, the Black Lives Matter, COVID, with Curtis. So a lot of fresh ideas and a lot of fresh insights, because they knew the people to go to get those kinds of insights from them.
Yeah. I'd add to that by saying that this Rolodex that you're referring to was certainly useful, but I think for me, the freshest part of the project was making these new connections, finding these new experts, these new socially aware and conscious people, and building these new relationships and getting these fresh ideas from people that I didn't know. So out of the dozens and dozens of people I talked to, more than half, or at least half, were people I hadn't met before, but had read about, had seen on television, commentating, and getting their perspective, living in the moment, because we were writing a story that was ever changing. Some, the January 6th hadn't happened yet. That was past our deadline, but we went back and included that. So many things continued to happen during the course of this work. And I'll be honest, I didn't think that, I thought that it would be interesting to see how the finished product came out with 5 different voices, but it reads as one. And we didn't ever compare notes to try to make it sound the same, like one person wrote it. It was just some symmetry there between the 5 of us that made this book something I think that is an easy read, but it's so informative and enlightening, and something that's going to, in the end, be something that a reference book, so to speak, down the line.
I wanted to say also, the fact that we are in a pandemic, it changed everything for me. I've been a feature writer all my life, but I'm used to knocking on doors, hitting the street, meeting people. And I've always kind of prided myself on the fact that I felt like if you can meet me, you are not going to say no. But you couldn't meet me.
Right.
So I had to go like, okay, so how am I going to convince these people? Particularly if I'm dealing with formerly incarcerated people, or people who have, sensitive information that they need to trust you to really be able to, to tell their stories and really be forthcoming. So I had to really ask myself, well, then how do I convince them to trust me? Not all of these folks had Zoom. They were not going to ever see me. So how, based on what comes out of my mouth, they don't get to see my body language. So I was saying, Google me, Google my stories, look at my website. And I have to say, of course, in the case with the folks that I did interview, because I wanted to make sure that in my chapter on locking up Black lives, that I talked to people who had been locked up, because it's very important that their voices be in there, and they are so often overlooked. And so, to just have to convince them, though, was a very interesting process. Took quite a bit of time. Sometimes I'd find somebody, but, then it's like I'd have to date them long distance in a way, or, we never got to meet. Now we're social media friend, we're friends on Facebook and Instagram and all of that, but it made it very different. Getting people to trust you, making sure that those voices of the people that we write about are in there. And like Curtis said, I think also it was very exciting to me to be able to meet people who are on the forefront of making these changes, of coming up, who have the vision on how we get out of this, how we move beyond this. Particularly, I consider myself an abolitionist, and meeting, really talking to people about what that means. What is abolition? What does a world look like that doesn't have prison, or what else is created? But those people who have really had the opportunity to give this deep thought. So it was exciting also, I think, for each of us to be able to do this.
One of the things is, talk about new voices, and Curtis is right. You go on the ones you have relationships with, and then they vouch for you, and they point you in the direction. And especially in the pandemic, where the new shoe leather is Zoom or recording on your phone, but you are relentless, you're persistent, and you're also honest. And I think people, at least the folks I spoke to, wanted to talk because nobody ever asked them questions before. When they talk about the Black church, nobody talks to Black women except as parishioners. They don't talk about the Black women as people who are authorities in theology. And I found out things like there are more Black women in seminaries than there are Black men. They just don't have the pulpits when they come out. And somebody like Patrice, who has lived experience as a pastor, and talking to some friends of mine who have gone into the ministry, and really listening to that, the things that they were addressing had never been addressed before, because that was always secondary to the movement, or secondary to the cause, or secondary to whatever message the mainstream titular head of the churches and organizations were always men. So when you talk to these women, they were glad to have someone who would just ask them a question and let's get out of the way and let them talk their truth, speak their mind, and let folks know, hey, we exist. This is how we can transform the movement for better, for Black lives, for a better nation. But somebody has to come and ask us and know that we are important. People always give the lip service, the Black woman, the backbone of this and the backbone of that, but you never hear them. You have to hear their voices. Let them speak for themselves.
I like to add to Patrice's point about not being able to go and knock on doors and see people face to face. In almost all of my interviews, and it was approaching 100 or so, I made sure it was via Zoom to try to build a connection so that they could see my face. And also, as a note to the young aspiring journalists, particularly when you don't know the source, it's important to make them relax. So research the person you're talking to. So before I got into what I really wanted to get into, I would talk to them about some other stuff I had read about them, and that warmed them up, made them feel like I respected their work. And when it was time to ask the questions that I wanted, they had already felt like, I know this guy a little bit. He's making eye contact. We're having a good conversation, so I can open up and feel free to share my genuine thoughts about the subjects that I wanted to talk about. So I'm zoomed out. I was zooming it like crazy, but it was worth it because I got really authentic stories and interesting insights into these people's minds who lent a great deal of value to the book.
Yeah,
I have to say that some of my people, didn't have access to Zoom. Or I talked to a young man who had been out of prison for 3 weeks. He didn't even know what Zoom was. Mm-hmm. So, there were, but I was going to say one thing I think that we each did, including Keith, and that people who read this will find out, is I think we did, to Nick's point, it was particularly important in his chapter, but I think we all asked people who aren't used to being asked. Mm-hmm. We didn't go to the old tried and true, the leaders, the experts. There are some of those voices, but we asked people who are not always asked.
I love this because, again, you talked about tapping into the Rolodex, and again, don't worry, folks. There are folks who are in our audience who are know what a Rolodex is and still have some buried in their desk drawer somewhere in the office. It's all right, right? But I think this notion of how you build those sources in the relationships, let's kind of unpack a little bit and maybe talk about a story that stands out that I think you established. Another key point is how you develop trust in a period of whether that was a phone call or again, Curtis, you said Zoom and everything else, and talking to people who maybe aren't even traditionally interviewed. But Patrice, what story stands out from those interviews that kind of help kind of crystallize this experience of pulling this book together?
Well, it's funny. They're little things, but not little. And I have to say also that I used my criminal record. In this case, it worked for me. But because as a young person, I was charged and found guilty of possession of heroin with intent to distribute. So I am a convicted felon. And so there's a lot of stuff on the internet about that. So that gives me, a certain amount of credibility with the population of people that I was really interested in getting voices from, because I know what it's like to have to live with that stigma, and I know what it's like to. I didn't have to do the time they did, but I have great respect for them, and so that was a good starting point. So there was the young man who had gotten out of prison. Had been out just 3 weeks. He was a child when he went in. He was 15 years old. I think when I talked to him, he was 37. But just a little thing, he was staying with his sister. And right after he got home, they decided they would have, a party for him. And he and his sister left the house that morning. And they got back like maybe 11 at night. Well, he had left the water running on one of the faucets all day long. Thank goodness there wasn't a stopper in the sink. But what he found out, what he realized was for years, for all those 20-some years, he had lived in a place where the water turned off automatically. And so, this was just one little thing. He didn't know how to use the gas pump, so it would, all these little things. And yet we don't think about this when people, come out or when they're in, to prepare them to enter into society again. Those are little things. So there are huge things too. There's the thing of just feeling safe walking down the street and not being afraid of people because you've been so used to living in an environment where you had to always watch your back. So just stories like that, it reminded me. And then looking back, I found a woman, a Black professor, who had done research. All my stuff takes place in Philly, so that was one reason I really hated I couldn't get out and go all over Philly and in North Philly. But this woman had done research that showed that in the first penitentiary that was built in this country, which was in Philadelphia, if you looked at that population, it was so similar to the population of people that we incarcerate today. The poorest, the Black people, disproportionately. So that also just stood out, as like I said, we began to connect all the dots in each of our chapters.
And Mike, you've covered politics for dozens of years, going back to, heck, David Dinkins back in New York and right on through Obama and even to current day. How do you talk to some of the folks about again, you focused a lot on the political climate here to bring those stories alive in a way in such a politically divisive time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tried to reach back, and for those students who may not know who some of these people are, I'm going to mention that's what Google's all about, I guess. They can learn. But reaching back to Adam Clayton Powell and writing about Obama, and Representative Shirley Chisholm and David Dinkins and Barbara Jordan, Charles Rangel. These are people who fought for racial equality, right, through legislation, through politics, through their political empowerment, and tried to bring about systemic change. And so I tried to bring the light to try to talk a little bit about how these Black politicians fought hard, but also a sense of hope. And I know when Dorothy Gilliam, talked in one of my sections about hope, and making sure that Black people and Black women, run for office, elected office, and fight for social change. So that's an important aspect, I think to bring out. And when you look around now, what do we have? We got Kamala Harris now, who's Vice President of the United States, Black woman. When did we ever think we'd see that? We said before, we'll never be around to see a Black president. There's Obama, but now we've got a Black female vice president. Curtis wrote a lot about the power of Black women in politics. So you talk about fresh. I mean, this is fresh. And one thing I just wanted to add, people sometimes people are starved to tell our stories, because Nick made a point that we don't talk. People, I've never had people get back to me so quickly. Once I leave a message on their voicemail or email. I mean, usually in our business, it's kind of like, oh God, we have to wait for people to call back, get our stories done. I mean, I'm inundated. People were calling me back and emailing, happy, thrilled to be involved in this project. So their voices will be told, right? And their voices will be shared. And there lies the names, say their names, right? And so we want to give voice to the voiceless, people, whose voices aren't heard. In writing again about politics, this is, politics, I talk about it impacts all of our lives in all areas of our lives, in healthcare and jobs, right? I mean, just, anything that you look at day to day that you're dealing with, there's some politics is behind it. And so if we're at the table as African-American men and women, no matter what you're doing, whether it's a local council race, right? Or a state race or national position, we need to be at the table to make these decisions for legislation to make sure that we improve the quality of life for our people. And it all starts with politics.
I think one of the things is, I know I try to do is challenge institutions. I think the institutions that exist, and even in Michael's talking about politics, and it's great to have Kamala Harris as vice president. It's really nice, and appreciate the work she's doing. But a lot of the institutions have failed us because we have always been faithful to them, but they have never been kept faith with us. And one of the important things about this book is to challenge folks to do what they always say they're going to do. Since George Floyd got shot, people have been going on record, we're going to do this, we're going to do DE&I, and we're looking and we're seeing people are giving, again, lip service to things that should become secondhand. And in this book, what we try to do, at least I know what I tried to do, and I know Curtis did, and Keith, Patrice, and Michael did, is say, hey, okay, you know something? What's really going on? Let's cut through all the PR. Let's cut through all the finery and get to what brass tacks is. And with brass tacks, Black and African-American communities are still at the lower index of all indices in the country: housing, healthcare, education. And that is not an accident. And too often people, to Michael's point, they think it's an individual or a few people well-placed. Well, it is institutions and systems that exist that have to be dismantled, challenged first, pointed out, and then try to dismantle them. And one of the things that helped us in Curtis' chapter, you can really see it with the Black Lives Matter movement. Here comes a movement that owes nothing not say nothing, but not a lot to old school institutions, and scared the hell out of Black folks. I forget white people, scared the hell out of Black people. And woman-led, queer-led, groups that white people marginalize Black people, and everybody marginalizes queer and trans people. But here came this powerful movement that has had legs since Trayvon Martin got killed. And going forward, we have different templates now of how we can challenge these systems. And in the book, you see how these new institutions, or I won't even say institutions, these new movements are growing and are standing up to the older ones and saying, hey, this is not going to work for us going forward. We don't want crumbs. We want a seat at the table. We don't think there's a finite pie. We think it's an infinite pie, and we want our slice.
And one of those systems that you're talking about, Nick, is the public health system. So everyone has read and watches the news and knows enough about coronavirus in terms of how it's impacted the community. But it's the interpretation based on, if you looked at the news enough, I know I looked at it and shook my head so often when they made it seem like being Black, that your skin pigmentation was where you were more prone to catching COVID. And that's not the case. The case is that we have been through systemic racism in public health, in every other walk of life. We've become more vulnerable because of racism, not because of our skin color. And I don't think the experts, quote unquote experts, explained that well enough on television when they talked about it. But we get into it quite heavily. I get into it quite heavily in the coronavirus section. There are so many myths and misinterpretations and misunderstandings, but I think outright that are so ridiculous that are still alive today. For instance, half of the white doctors who are in medical school right now have admitted to believing that Black people who take pain don't feel pain as much as white people, or that our skin is thicker and our blood runs slower. And those things lead to how we're treated, and which means we're mistreated. And so these kind of myths that exist are part of the problem, this whole systemic problem that exists in all walks of life. But in the public health, it really damaged us during the coronavirus because we've been struggling so long with all of this malfeasance that has existed since the beginning of time for us.
One of the things like Curtis just talked about in public health, we missed the opioid epidemic because doctors wouldn't prescribe opioids to us because they thought we could stand the pain, and they were worried that we would get hooked because we get easily hooked on drugs. But now the overdose deaths, and we know the high profile ones, DMX, Michael K. Williams, the overdose deaths in the Black community, the rate has now exceeded the white community and the Latino community. It always comes around to how they treat us at the end of the day. And they move on from once other people seem to have had a handle on it. It happened with the HIV/AIDS crisis when it was a white male gay disease. Everybody and their mom was throwing the kitchen sink at it. Now that a lot of the folks who are getting infected, living longer because they have drugs and cocktails, but they're African American and they're female, you don't hear as much. Nobody does as many stories about it. And so we always have to keep pushing and fighting against those institutions and structures and systems that Curtis is talking about. How can you have the future medical establishment still thinking things like they do? Which means that, what does that mean for my kids and my grandkids when I'm not here? Are they going to be getting any kind of better care, even as more medical advancements happen every year? So those are the questions that we pose, that we unearth, we examine, and there's so much more to look at.
These are great stories. And I can imagine for every one of you, based on what you're saying now, you had a wide range of emotions in talking to your sources. And then, you amassed all these wonderful interviews and had all these notes and research, and what was the writing process like? How did you get over the anger, the passion, to write this as clear and strongly as you guys have done in this book, and trying to lay out the context? And again, for those of you who want to read this book, again, it's broken into categories and again merges these voices from different walks of life, from addressing issues from race and policing and incarceration and Black church and politics. But as journalists, we all kind of get emotionally involved in these. How did you manage that emotion to write these your sections of the book? And I don't know, Patrice, if you want to dive in, and because again, this is a subject you've written about in the past, but how did you kind of pull yourself together to kind of make this work?
Well, I had never written about it during a pandemic when Black people were continuing to be killed on the streets by police. So we were writing this just like in real time. I remember there were days when I did feel quite depressed about my material. But when I stepped away from that, the reality of that we were all living was just as depressing. So, all those things that I used to do for relief, whether it was take a trip abroad or, we couldn't do any of that. And so that, I think, was just, you had to constantly I did. I dig deep and say, I think that's when the passion really carries you, because I think that each of us had passion for what we wrote about. And that's where the passion really kicks in, where you feel like, okay, if I can't get out there and march right now because I got this deadline, but I can write the hell out of this chapter, and it will forever be available for somebody to pick up and learn and have hope too, and understand, what needs to happen to get us out of it. So.
And all of those emotions that I experienced in working on this project, none of them were joy. They were all adding to my angst that I carry with me every day as a Black man in America. And a lot of not only was I doing interviews, but I was doing a lot of research too. And for instance, looking at how past incidents of violence against Black people, just doing that kind of search, I learned about what some of the things that had happened to, like in New York, for instance. There was an orphanage in New York that housed 500 Black kids. This is in the 1800s. And white men got mad because of the draft and went and attacked the place and burned down the orphanage. Thankfully, the kids got out through the back door. But those kind of things just raises your temperature as you're researching and putting it in the book. In 1793, I think, when the yellow fever broke out in Philadelphia, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and other government officials fled the city, but told Black people to stay behind because you guys can't get it. So stay behind and help the white people who couldn't flee the city. And of course, Black people trying to fit in, stayed, and 200, almost 300 of them died from yellow fever. So learning about this stuff was an education for sure. And it made me really feel good about the book, because I think people are going to learn more and feel much more connected to the history, because in a sense it is a history book, but it's very frustrating. So I had a lot of good wine to suppress some of my anxiety that was created doing the emotional parts of writing and researching this book.
I find that, and those who know me know I wear some of my emotion on my sleeve. And they go back, and I know Curtis had pulled me back a couple of times, and so has Michael. And I think over the years, a lot of the things that frustration levels that I might have had writing about in this book, I have had writing about just regular stories every day, and having to deal with white editors who did not see the importance of the subject, did not take those people I wanted to bring voice to as seriously as they would others. A little older now, so I take my blood pressure medication. But what keeps me going, and I know what keeps all 5 of us going, is a unchallenged love for Black people and an unchallenged commitment to Black communities to inform and uplift where we can. And so every time I spoke to, and this is when you talk to people of faith and your faith is shaky, no matter what has happened to them, they're still there. And talking to these women who have experienced gender bias, who can't get congregations to look at them in the kind of way that they look at male pastors, they're not angry. They're not upset. They're just saying, we're not going anywhere. And they don't give up. And I think that's the most important thing. And I got a good education in how to be perseverant, how to always persevere. And my Black joy came from talking to a lot of these folks who they know the deck is stacked. They can see the dealer dealing from the bottom of the deck, and they're still not getting up from the table. Yeah. And if you can do that, and you see people who you know, why isn't she running this, or at the head of this church, or really more influential? They don't really care about all that. All they care about is, how do we connect with our communities? How do we keep faith with our theology, and how we let other Black people know, to Patrice's point, not to give up hope?
And when you ask Neil about how do you get past it, I don't think any of us got past it. I'm still in it. Writing about, it's easy sometimes when, we all talk about the deadlines and writing stories. You write a story, you put it to bed, and you go to bed, right? And you turn it off. What you can't turn off is still being Black. So you write your story, you file your story, but you're still Black, at the end of the day. So you go out and it's still racial profiling. People are still looking at you sideways because you're Black in a store. You get pulled over, racial profiling because you're Black. So we deal with this repeatedly, still dealing with it. And it reminded me when I wrote in the one of the sections about 1990s covering an event in New York City, which is arguably one of the ugliest race riots, race demonstrations, I should say, in New York City history. 10,000 white police officers, right? Off duty, many with guns, many drinking beer, protesting then Mayor Dinkins' policies, using the N-word repeatedly. I'm in the middle of this, covering this, go back to one of my editors who did not believe that these police officers were using the N-word and questioned my reporting about it. It wasn't until several other white reporters came in to say the same thing that they believed it. So, it got so intense that one of the City Hall police officers, detectives with Mayor Dinkins' detail came out and asked me to come inside of City Hall because they were concerned about my safety covering these 10,000 white police officers. So we deal with this all the time. So part of what is happening here with this book is it's cumulative, and we're battle tested and battle weary, in some extent. But this was a project that was so important for us to produce that was it emotional? Yes. But you know what I'll say? And there are people who will say, the purists, well, you got to take emotion, out of reporting. No, you know what? This book is powerful because of our emotions.
I think one of the things, Michael was talking, and you can tell Michael is being nice when he says demonstration. It was a riot. And that the language is important, what we use, how we use it. We had internal discussions about, was George Floyd killed? Was he murdered? Because it wasn't a trial yet. He was murdered. And I think one of the things about saying their names is also calling things as they are and not prettifying them and pulling back. 1991, those cops were rioters. The January 6th folks were insurrectionists. Derek Chauvin, the former officer, is a murderer. Calling things out as they are and not sugarcoating them for any audience, whether our own audience or those who from broader community might come to us, and letting folks know this is what's going on. Because if we don't say it, no one is going to hear it. And folks need to know what is really going on.
One person back then asked me, sort of ridiculous, right? Why weren't these cops arrested? Because they were all there. I mean, come on, why weren't they arrested? They were all there.
That was a good day in Brooklyn to rob people's houses because nobody was coming.
Right.
Nobody was coming to find out what happened.
When Nick jokes about being pulled back, and the one beauty about this project with everybody is, and they're all being modest, Neil, Patrice immediately, do you want to do? Yes. Curtis, yes. Nick, yes. Keith, yes. The one question Nick asked me was, or not even asked, told me, he says, I'm going to tell the truth. Right? I've got something to say. I'm going to tell the truth. That's what we want. Yes, Nick, we want the truth. So this book is about the truth.
Yeah, Patrice, you were about to dive in.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that note. When we talk about the truth, I think we all found some truths maybe that we didn't know, and that other people we feel do not know, like some of that history about the Black orphanage, and when you're really steeped in it too. I know I was angry a lot. I was really angry. And even, it's funny, I thought I had gotten away from it, but as we talk about this, I feel a little bit of anger coming on. But, when you are looking at the history of our existence in this country, and when you really are looking at it deeply, it's so traumatic. When I looked at slavery and then prison, and then when they still needed cheap labor, so they had convict leasing. And in the South, that meant that somebody who had been a Confederate soldier or the head of the KKK could pay, like, I don't know if it was $6 a month, and pretty much own you. And can you imagine the terror of a Black person who would have to go and is now supposed to be free, but did something like maybe was loitering and ends up being pretty much owned again by somebody who was a head of a KKK? And so we end up having these bodies, I mean, just mass burial grounds that are being discovered where some of these people, they just work them to death, you know, the steel industry, the sugar industry, and just work these Black people to death. And so here we are, you know, we're dealing with all of this stuff in our heads while we're living through this pandemic and going through the, you know, one death after one, murder after another, as Nick says. I mean, it really was. I don't know that I have ever been through a more intense reporting experience. I've had some that were brutal, pretty brutal and long when I worked on a murder case, but this so in such a, you know, all intense during this period of time, and you know, it just it was a lot. It really was. But what we came up with, I think, made it all worth it.
You know, people, we think about, and we've talked about this, of this being, you know, a lot of history, but it's not history. It's going on right now. This is also not just a tome about history. This is a mirror that we can put up to society and say, hey, look, let's look and see what the reflection looks like. You know, we talk about now, you know, part attached to incarceration, 3 strikes, and now all of a sudden there are people making lots of money off of marijuana, and they don't look like us, and we're still in jail for having sold a dime bag 7 years ago. So we seem to always be on the receiving end of the punitive and never get the benefits of anything. And as we go forward, this is materialized and is evidenced in all industries across the board. So say their names, how Black Lives Came to Matter in America, isn't just about the yellow fever incident that Curtis is talking about. It isn't just about the small time or the time that Patrice did or the people she talked to. It's happening right now as we speak in different parts of these countries, different parts of this country. What's going on in Texas politically is going on right now, where they're redrawing district lines to make sure that white people stay in power, even though they're no longer a majority in the state. These are things that we as a group may write about in the future, but they're not dead history. This is not something that you just passive. This book is an active document that can be added to at any time. This is a modern day Google Doc, and you just keep adding every time you go, just keep adding stuff, because it all fits and it all tracks back to the same original sin that we won't deal with.
I've got you know, phone calls from people who have read some of the advanced copies. The social workers, a few have reached out to me and talked about, you know, Patrice's section and what they've learned. People of faith, you know, who read Nick's section and learned and agree. A good friend of mine, a physician, who read about new names and voices that Curtis wrote about Black doctors, people who have not been heard of before that we talked about, you know, not just regular names, new folks, right, with new ideas. And so that's heartening, you know, for me and for all of us, you know, the people who are learning. I learned, and here's something else that we, you know, for your students, we're all learning, right? All evolving, always learning. I learned something from every section, right, that these writers wrote about, something I didn't know. And, you know, we're jaded sometimes when we think, oh, we know everything, right? I'm learning. So, you know, here I am at my age, you know, you know, here I am, you know, learning from Curtis, learning from Nick, learning from Patrice, learning from Keith, you know, so this is a wonderful thing. This is a wonderful project, and just so proud to be a part of it.
I want to kind of wrap up, and you guys hit some of the themes that I wanted to address in terms of what people should take away from this book in terms of the truth of the of mirroring history with reality, and actually it being a living history. And really, yeah, some of the role of us as journalists throughout our careers of, being drilled in our head, we have to be objective and non-biased, and we're living in a world when all of these issues now are coming to head of how do we challenge truth, how do we challenge those who are supposed to be telling us the truth who are lying to us, and how do we make sure we hold those accountable. And it sounds like your book is kind of not only fulfilling so many fundamentals, right? Voices to the voiceless and holding powerful account. So just quickly, what are the lessons that you kind of want people to take away from this book? And as people kind of have learned about you, and again, I intentionally wanted to spend more time talking about the book than going through each of your very lengthy bios that are going to be available on the Mayborn.com. So please, my friends, as you've listened to this panel, if you haven't read the bios of each of these individuals who are award-winning book writers, extensive careers in journalism, who have taken this moment to capture what we will all kind of remember in our own way and through our own experience, about a year and a half in our lives that for many of us was not just a year and a half, it was our lives and continues to be our lives. But Curtis, what are some lessons, or a lesson and when people say, hey, what have you been working on? That book, it's coming out. So what am I going to get from this? What am I going to learn?
Ooh, how much time do we have left? There's so
That's
much.
part
there.
2 of the panel, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's so much there. There's a doctor in Minnesota named Dr. Rachel Hardiman. 7 years ago, she used the word white supremacy in the New England Journal of Medicine for the first time. And she said that racism should be declared a public health crisis. And her white counterparts tried to placate her. But for 7 years since then, she's been on this mission to at least make sure that people understand that. I think in a very real way, this book shares that notion throughout each section. White supremacy and racism has been a force that has been devastating to us. And obviously we hear the phrase, we've come a long way. We certainly have. Things have changed, things have gotten better. But the things that we wrote about in that book, as Nick said, were happening in that moment. We were living in it. We were living in a pandemic, writing about a pandemic, writing about a social justice movement as it was taking place. So I don't doubt for a second that people will close that book at the end and say, I'm a much more informed person on so many different levels having read this book. That's about the best thing I can say, because there's so many intricate details, so much to learn from every chapter. I've had such a great time. I went to Mexico. I was reading the book there, and man, it just brought me back to that time and place when we were working on it. But it also just made me proud of my colleagues. We did some great work.
I've always said that journalists are like coal miners. You go in, you dig, you get the coal out to fuel whatever you're fueling. I know it's a fossil fuel, but that's the metaphor I'm going for. But as a Black journalist, you're also the canary. You're also the person in the mine when stuff is not right. You point it out first, and you end up usually being dead or being dismissed. I think because of our long years of experience, talented folks, I'm the least talented of the bunch, we can tell the stories. We are not constrained anymore. And in a book where we can really delve into things, we can tell the story. I want people to go and look not just at whatever they may think is criticism of the church, but what is the meaning of church? What is the role of the church? The role of the Black church is totally different than the role of, quote unquote, the white church, because we have so often had to lean on the church as one of the few institutions that were ours. And I think in some respect, when you read the chapter about the church, you see some of the church has drifted. Some of the church still gives lip service to some stuff, but does not embrace fully what it is to be liberating or helping folks feel free, really supporting people. It can't be just Reverend Barber trying to feed people. It has to be a concerted, comprehensive effort. That's what I want people to look at and say, how do we bring that about?
I want to just, yeah, in my chapter, I want people to notice that nearly every person who has been incarcerated, who I've profiled, mentions that they came to a point in their life where they felt no hope. And I want us to understand how important it is that we create environments in which all people, but we have allowed ourselves, we've built these communities, particularly I'm talking about inner city places with no greenery, no resources. Communities can't even be communities. Neighbors can't support one another, and we've left them. We have schools that cannot even adequately educate children because we don't give them the resources, and children who are traumatized daily. I remember one of my folks saying that by the time he started selling drugs, well, it was like he was somebody held him at gunpoint at say age 7 and took his bike, and by age 11 he had seen somebody get gunned down, and by 13 he held his best friend while he died in the street. I mean, it goes over and over. And then we take people who have been traumatized and we put them in a place of trauma. So I want them to see what we do, what we create, and understand also, because I reported on how other countries do it. They don't do it the same way. They do it differently. They don't have prisons where there are more than 2 million people. They don't give people life sentences, which we now call death sentences, where they never get out. And yet they have less crime. And so, it's all in there for you to see all together, all these different stories, all the reporting we've all done. It's there now for you to see. So I want them to see that and to walk away knowing that this greatest country has fallen very short on what it can do. And perhaps one of the reasons is because it locks away so much of its potential.
Mike?
I'll make it brief. In one section I wrote, who will stand up for us? Who will champion our causes? Who will have our backs? Who will have the courage to speak our names? So I'm hoping that this book will arm readers with information, arm them with a spiritual suit of armor that they can go out and move to action, make change, maybe change some hearts. I don't know, but to make lasting change and to try to eradicate systemic racism. Again, this is a book for everyone. It's not just a book for us. It's a book for people that may need their minds altered, and maybe we can help change some minds and some hearts along the way. So I'm just hoping that we can arm these people with information so they can move to action.
I'd like to add one more thing, Neil. I think the book also came together because the editor who bought the book, a white woman named Maddie Caldwell, was a very strong editor who embraced our vision. She trusted us to tell the story. She was smart. She was aggressive. And I think that's, when you're writing a book, that editor is a key part to being produced in a way that gets across the message that we want to get across. And I think we conveyed what we wanted to convey. And Maddie was very key in that process.
I think one of the important things Curtis says about Maddie, she was open to the challenges that we brought sometimes. Yeah. I think her age, she was open. She may not always have agreed, but she also understood where her experience may end, always keeps going, particularly around the subject matter that we were covering. And that was important for her to go and trust us she trusted us to know what we were talking about.
Yeah.
Let's not forget, we don't want to get in trouble. Jenny Herrera.
You don't want to get in trouble.
we don't want to get in trouble. Jenny was our agent. And when I first took this project, before it even got to Maddie, Jenny had to sign off on it and had to be confident, right, that she could shop this to a publisher who would embrace it. So thanks to Jenny too, because she didn't bat an eye. She was with us every step of the way. And so I've learned, thank your agent. So
It's funny. You thank your agent, but you also say to the book publisher, tip my hat, because to Michael's point, this doesn't usually happen. You don't get, different people, 5 different authors putting together a book with such general themes, but seems seamless. And they trusted us to do it.
they did.
And I think that we delivered, and that bodes well, not just for us going forward, but for other authors who may want to do the same thing.
It does. And we look at this as a model because it is successful. I mean, we did it because there were some consternation, about being able to pull 5 writers together to write in one voice. And could this be done? And can it be done in 6 months? Yeah. And I said, yes. Didn't know what I was talking about. And,
Magical Cottman.
And then ask all the students who you're looking at today, these writers, to say, let's do this. So this was it was something that was supposed to happen. I believe that.
That's great. And we had Jenny Herrera last year was able to be on our agents panel talking about the great work that she's done. So, and thanks for adding that, because so many of our folks attending the conference are, if they haven't written a book, are trying to figure out that path to write a book. Each of you all kind of come through traditional journalism in many different ways. So a lot of our audience are, again, those kind of folks that figure out, how do I take those skills into the next level? You all have talked about truth telling. You've all talked about dusting off the Rolodex and picking up the phone and not only calling some of the people but finding new voices, finding new sources, and going even deeper, which I think sometimes is lost, is that history does matter in these stories, no matter how much we know about the story themselves. And I had asked earlier, well, how do you not make this cliche? And I think you all address the fact that there's a history to this, and with each iteration, here we are in 2020, 2021, telling these stories. There's a new version of this history that you all have tried to capture and have captured in this book. Say Their Names: How Black Lives Came to Matter in America. It's been my deep honor and pleasure to, one, have you all as my friends and are in my Rolodex, but also sharing your wisdom, your experience to our audience, and to the many others around the country who are going to read this book and learn. What I think the point you all have made is that everyone's going to learn something from this book, no matter how much you think you know. Curtis Bunn, Nick Charles, Michael Cottman, Patrice Gaines, and Keith Hairston. We know you're here with us in spirit. But thank you all for taking the time to share this with our audience, and looking forward to diving into the book, and hopefully our many members of our audience will dive in as well.
Thank you, Neil.
So much, Neil. Appreciate it. It was great.